Welcome everyone to Nican Tlaca Women Warriors podcast. This is our monthly podcast where we talk about decolonization, education, and liberation for our people of the Western Hemisphere, Semanahuac, what is known for the people of Mexico, Central America, South America, and Native American. The term we use is Nican Tlaca. Today we are very excited to talk about the concept of genocide, how it's been applied to our people and how it has not. Giving you a short history of primary sources, documentation, experiences, and the politics behind such a term. So to start off with, just to introduce, we have Sister Ayari.
Today I'm going to talk about the smallpox terrorism or biological terrorism that Europeans engaged with us.
And then we have Sister Shoshishiwi.
The Mexica, we're going to be talking about the genocide of our major holiday that we have as indigenous people, which is known as Dia de los Muertos, and what we can do to change the further genocide of our holidays that we know.
So to start us off, we want to share a poem entitled The War Cry of the Forgotten Women, and all three of us are going to read this. So listen in. War Cry of the Forgotten Women. See these obsidian blades shoot out my mouth, show you the rage of a people locked in a cage, built with their bones and fed their own blood. Hear our war cry, we the forgotten women. See this obsidian blade shoot out my mouth, our presence rejected on the white man's page. See this obsidian blade shoot out my mouth, as I tell you now the story of us. Clear all the doubts of our courage to fight the white supremacists throughout our continent. Our neglected acts of rebellion will now be in your face, exposed for all of our people to embrace. The forgotten women, belittled and overlooked since 1492, seen as mere commodities for the invaders to enjoy. Stealing our land, infected us with smallpox, purposely killed 95% of our population, and here we are claiming a Spanish grandfather, ashamed of who we are, bleaching our hair blonde, popping blue-eye contacts, Concha Nácar selling us skin bleaching creams to bury away our identity. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry. Hear our war cry. We, the forgotten women. This is not the story of Pocahontas, not the story of Malinche, not the story of Chel, from Road to El Dorado, from Steven Spielberg. This is a true story. Women warriors of this occupied nation in 1492, we rather commit suicide than have our vaginas stabbed with venomous dicks. When we met the original motherfuckers in 1492 and 1519, they force-fucked our mothers, and now we are supposed to believe that it was a love story. Sprinkle some hearts and a pink backdrop, and the rape scene is supposed to look like a honeymoon retreat. Bullshit. We here, the women, resisted. We were doctors, poets, teachers, merchants, writers, priestess, mothers, daughters, grandmothers. En Tenochtitlan, en Cahokia, en Caral, en Bolivia, en Guatemala, en Hopi, Bindene, and Tongvaland, Shumash. Daughters of corn, masters of time, calculating each time a child was born. We planted the original seeds of a civilization. We planted our corn. Now faced with the destruction of our people's nation, we are here. We are those women who are ignored by Europeans, writing because they were disgusted to see us educated, disgusted to see us handling our shit. Meanwhile, they burnt their women at stake for studying medicine. 1492, 1519 came to us like lightning to burn through our cities and our humanity. We, women, the original women of this continent, did not just stand there, did not just sit there, actions hidden from your view because they don't want us to give you any ideas of what it means to resist. Nican Tlaca women, warriors all over our continent. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry. We are those Mexica women that during the bloodiest battles against the Spaniards dressed up like Mexica warriors and fought the Europeans, and they massacred us. We are those indigenous women who rather commit suicide than be raped by them. We are the warrior women whose arm they chopped, whose babies they stabbed in our bellies as we fought. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry.
We are the Inca warrior Lorenza Vename, who the Spaniards called La India del Diablo, who was decapitated for organizing uprising against the Spanish crown in 1725. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry. We are the Inca warrior Manuela Bastidas, organized rebellions, and for her courage, she ended up with her tongue cut out, strangled, public execution, May 18, 1781. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry. We are the Tomba warrior. Topurina helped lead a rebellion in Mission San Juan Gabriel Arcangel, who said upon being put to trial, I hate the Pares and all of you for living here on my native soil, for trespassing upon the land of my forefathers and despoiling our tribal domains. We are Toipurina, standing in the cold room, October 25, 1785. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry. We are those and many other warrior women who remain nameless because they want their colonization to continue painless and blood-free in their version of white history. White supremacist is shameless. But their poisonous lies won't tame us. Their normalization of our genocide is beyond sadistic. Let me remind you, let me scream at the top of my lungs.
See these obsidian blades shoot out of my mouth. We are the forgotten women. This is our war cry. Slice through this matrix of white supremacy that has us on our knees and willing victims in our own genocide. You know what I am talking about? Brown on brown genocide. See these obsidian blades shoot out my mouth. Mexican, Central American, Native American, South American, my beautiful people of this continent. They want us to sleep deep in their trance. They give us the American dream as we wake and face the nightmares of their colonial reality. Our pride left empty, our hearts left bruised. We are buried in deep in the veins of this colonial monster. We are homeless in our homeland, went from the most educated people in the world to the highest high school dropout rates. Use their colonial terms like Hispanic and Latino to blend into their identity scheme venom and accept the lie that tells us we are all illegal on our own lands. Hear our war cry. We, the forgotten women. Let us live in you today, tomorrow, in your future. Hear our war cry. Let these blades of obsidian tear through the lies that keep us sedated and hypnotized. Hear our war cry. Toipurina, Manuela Bastidas, Lorenza Avename, Frida Kahlo, Maria, unnamed warriors, unnamed heroes. Hear our cry. They didn't finish with us all. They couldn't possibly kill us all. We are the survivors of the world's biggest genocide. Making a comeback to what is ours, 520 years will pass on to be the memory of the period in time when we were all blind, lost, and confined to colonizers' created ignorance. See these obsidian blades shoot out my mouth. Show you the rage of a people locked in a cage, built with their bones and fed with their own blood. Hear our war cry. We, the forgotten women, see these obsidian blades shoot out my mouth. See these obsidian blades shoot out my mouth. Our aim is to defend our occupied continent. Hear our war cry. Hear our war cry. It's time to put an end to this genocide.
And with that, we're going to continue with the topic of genocide. Just a few days ago, this colonial country and many other colonial countries of this continent celebrated the beginning of the largest genocide committed in the history of humanity. They celebrated Columbus Day. In order to honor our ancestors, first we have to honor those of us that are survivors of this genocide. Those 5% of us are here. We descend from those survivors, the initial survivors of the genocide. In order to talk about genocide, it is important to understand why the term genocide has not been applied to our experience as Nican Tlaca people, as indigenous people. We have definitely suffered genocide, but yet academia and mainstream politics and media continue to deny us this description and this concept. So to begin, I'm going to read from you from some of the writings from a research paper that I wrote about 2 years ago, talking about the injustice and talking about the racist implication and the racist overlooking and glossing over our experience from genocide. We have to understand that the concept of genocide was created by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew, and I'm going to get more to that now. It says, whether to decide to use the concept of genocide it's a debate right now in academia. Even the most so-called progressive historians shy away from using it. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jew, had a major role in articulating the United Nations definition of genocide. Lemkin was a Polish Jew who helped establish the modern concept of genocide as adopted by the United Nations amidst the Jewish Holocaust. Lemkin researched genocides all over the world, but died before publishing his vital work. According to Lemkin, with very few exceptions, and here comes a quote, the colonists of New Spain were guilty of genocide and firmly resolved to frustrate all efforts at stopping it, end quote. This is the clearest and strongest endorsement of the applicability of the concept of genocide by the man who coined the term for the UN to the experience of the indigenous people of Semanawak. Moreover, Lemkin dedicated parts of his writing to the experience of our Nican Tlaca people of this continent. In his essay entitled Spanish Treatment of the Southern American Indians, end quote, he made references to Las Casas and concludes in his findings that were indeed definitive of genocide. In Lemkin's section entitled, quote, Methods of Genocide, Physical, end quote, he includes examples of the massacre where, quote, slavery and deprivation of livelihood, family life was disregarded, bread made root meal was often the only food. When the slaves fell sick, they were left to die or at best sent home. The treatment of Indian women constituted an aspect of biological genocide. The death of the race, slave mothers exhausted with hunger fatigue, could not nurse their babies. It is important to note, end quote, it is important to note that Lemkin's mention of biological warfare did not involve germ warfare, as future historians would argue. This may have been due to the lack of information available at the time on this subject. Estimates of the amount of deaths due to the disease was not well established either when he wrote this particular study. However, Lemkin's definition continues to be debated and criticized. Lemkin's initial definition has been altered by many historians who either expand it or narrow it down. No matter how the term is interpreted, it remains a powerful definition of a crime that has been accepted by 146 nations who have signed the document through the Genocide Convention. The importance of such a term allows it to be used as a legal instrument that can be used for accountability and human rights. Whatever disagreements arise on the application of the term genocide, Lemkin gave enough examples and research to be able to utilize it in relation to Semanawak. When we look at all the details of his definition, it is clear that genocide is a process of dehumanization that deals with more than the physical destruction of a group of people. Lemkin described genocide as a complete process that not only refers to the physical killing of a group of people, but also acts aimed at destroying the people in many ways. For example, according to Lemkin, colonizing itself is a genocidal act because it inevitably destroys the indigenous populations and/or their livelihoods as it forcibly imposes new settlements on the land. He also refers to biological warfare when writing how the Spanish deliberately stunned the population of the Nican Tlaca of Semanawak by overworking and enslaving Native American men and women. Last but not least, he includes attack on language, economic resources, and cultural norms of a population as acts within the definition of genocide. Many historians have documented the various ways which such destructive and therefore genocidal acts have been committed by Europeans on our population. So to talk about that, we have to understand that the concept of genocide today, in academia today, it is not applied to our experience. When we look at mainstream media, it is not applied to our condition. They euphemize it. They talk about Indian battles and the coming of the two worlds. There's always some type of fairy tale notion, this myth making of white supremacy that obviously hides away the pain of us as an indigenous people. And it's really important to understand that we, first of all, as indigenous people, we don't connect to being indigenous. We don't identify as being indigenous because we have, first of all, the systemic destruction of our knowledge, of our history. And then we also have the use of terms like Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, raza mestizo that further robs us away from who we are as a people. And it's really important to understand that the fact that Mexican, Central American, Native American, South Americans don't know their history, that didn't come naturally. That was systematically created for us to be this way. It was purposely done. How did it happen? It happened by them forbidding our knowledge. They prohibited the study of indigenous culture. They prohibited the study of indigenous traditions and knowledge. Anything to do with indigenous culture was prohibited. The ultimate definition that was incorporated by the United Nations after taking into account what Raphael Lemkin wrote is the following. Genocide is the planned annihilation of a national or racial group by a variety of actions aimed at undermining the foundations essential to the survival of a group as a group. And again, why don't we know this history? This because we have been deliberately kept ignorant from it. I'm going to read you from a law that was written in 1554 that was precisely used to destroy our indigenous knowledge. We have to understand that at this time, the Spanish government was definitely working hand in hand with the Catholic Church and the Spanish Crown, worked hand in hand together, destroying indigenous knowledge. If you look at primary sources, if you look at the codices, it is obvious to see how they were destroying the codices, they were destroying the statues, they were destroying anything to do with indigenous identity, history, and heritage. Under the whole guise of religion or idolatry, they use extirpation campaigns to persecute our people. We have to really understand that. We didn't become Catholic just one day decided it's a beautiful religion, let's be Catholic and Christian. It didn't happen like that. Our people were persecuted, our people were killed, our people were threatened by the sword to be butchered and massacred. And what would happen? We have to understand the initial destruction of our culture, the initial ways after we survived and we're surviving daily this genocide. Those of us that survived, they were filtering our communities. They would go town to town, home to home. They were searching our houses to see if we had any remnants of indigenous knowledge, of indigenous writing, of indigenous art. Anything to do with the indigenous identity was destroyed and was considered to be the work of the devil. And that's what they used to destroy our people. Those of our people that were the elders or the leaders of our community that knew this knowledge, they were publicly executed. They were publicly executed time and time again. And this was done to the point where our people at the very end, now you see the majority of us practice Catholicism and Christianity without the slightest idea of this violent and tragic experience that our ancestors went through. What you're seeing now on the screen, it shows you the example that was taken, and this is in Fray Jerónimo de Mendieta in 1554. This is one of the illustrations that was given to show you. If you see they're burning, right? They're obviously burning not just books, but any type of art, any type of symbols of indigenous history. And at the very bottom of the image, I'm translating here, it says, torching of all the clothing and books and of the idolatrous priest, and they were burned by the friars. So this is part of their systematic governmental and religious destruction of indigenous knowledge. And I'm going to read a quote from the actual Mendieta account from 1554. And this is at the top. It says, "The friars took with them the children and young men they had raised and instructed. They also received help from the common people who were already converted and wanted to prove that they were confirmed by faith." And again, we have to be very critical with these primary sources. There's writing this for the Spanish Crown. They want to make it seem like all of our people were there with them, participating out of their own free will, but they're not talking about how they publicly executed the fathers of these children, the mothers of these children, and these people were forced into this type of terrorist act, the terrorist act of destroying their own culture. So with that, just another thing to let you know, there was also another law written that was describing that the actual Spanish crown, after they had already commissioned Sahagún and other priests to write about indigenous knowledge, they also wrote laws afterwards saying that they should forbid, that they shouldn't allow anything else to be written about indigenous history. And I want to read you the direct quote from this letter that was used, and we're going to be posting it on the screen right now. But just for us, we have to understand that the history of how we became ignorant, the fact that we don't know our history today, it's not normal. That's not normal for a group of people to survive such a tragic genocide, not to know our history. It was systemically done, and that's what we are not told. Like, for example, they're changing the history today, right? The whole thing that's happening in Texas, that's been happening for 5 centuries. They've been rewriting, whitewashing history. They don't want to talk about the genocide. They don't want to refer to the painful experience of colonization because they have a lot to lose. Their whole moralization of occupation and colonization of this colonial country, it's at stake when you talk about the truth of indigenous genocide. And it's really important for us to trace the beginnings of how this systematic approach and system of white supremacy, how it developed and how it created the reality that we are in today. So today, in 2017, we don't know our history because of letters written by the Spanish crown and many other edicts that were meant to destroy our history and our identity. It's really important for us to understand that. We have to understand also how the church participated in the destruction of our history by lending themselves, by blessing, by doing all these blessings of our genocide. It was all blessed by the Catholic Church. So right now, what you're seeing on the screen, this is a direct quote from the letter written in 1577 by King Philip II. He wrote a letter to the Viceroy Martin Enriquez. This is quote by quote the most current translation that we have of this letter. It says, "As soon as you receive our decree, you must proceed with much care and diligence to seize those books without any original or copy remaining, and to send them carefully guarded at the first opportunity to our Council of the Indies, so that they may be examined there. Do not allow any person to write things having to do with the superstitious and the way of life of the natives in any language." End quote. That law was written on April 22nd, 1577. We are suffering the consequences of these laws because whatever indigenous history was written was forbidden. It was prohibited. The Florentine Codex that survived, it was also banned. The good thing is that Sahagún had written an extra copy that made its way outside of his own hands because he was forbidden to write about it. And what he did, he sent an extra copy. So if it wasn't for him sending that extra copy, we would have no knowledge of the Florentine Codex because that too was prohibited by the Spanish crown. We have to be very aware of that. We cannot naturalize our colonized condition. We cannot naturalize our state of ignorance because we have to understand that this was intentional. We have been intentionally kept ignorant of this history. It has been intentional and it has been purposeful, and we are living that example because we don't connect with the experience. We don't connect with the genocide because we don't even identify as indigenous. We don't even identify as genocide. And in another podcast, we're going to get into the deconstruction of the concept of mestizaje. And Sister Ayari is putting together an awesome presentation on this. And we're going to go in. We're going to unpack all of these notions of white supremacy that are within the concept of raza and mestizaje, and which is another tool that they've kept to keep us ignorant. They're using it against us. They're keeping us ignorant and disconnected from who we are, which is really important why we continue to honor our ancestors, why we continue to deconstruct, confront, and liberate our people from these white supremacist notions of identity and representation. And we have to understand that we are not just the survivors of the initial genocide. Every day that we live, we are surviving genocide. Let us make that very clear. We as indigenous people are surviving genocide on a daily basis. At this point, I want to have Ayari share more perspectives on genocide. She's going to talk more about the assimilation aspect of genocide and the indigenous rights issue and conflict. And also she's going to address biological terrorism in our genocidal experience. So Sister Yari, please share with us.
So I want to start off by saying that the United Nations through Lemkin define genocide, but there's also articles on indigenous rights. But before, like, I would like to present the actual legal definition of genocide, because it's very important to know. So when we're getting this information, we know that there's a pretty much a bullet point on how to define it. The issue is really black and white. It's not, is this really genocide? No, it's a really black and white issue, and we as indigenous people fall under it. And by technicality, that term was created by looking at what happened to our societies. So let's start off by reading the legal definition of genocide from the United Nations. Genocide is defined in Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 1948, as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group condition of life calculated to bring it about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to any other group. So as I read that's exactly what they did to us. So we are people that survived the genocide. And even genocide, people think that, oh, well, if the group is alive, then the genocide didn't happen. That's not true. Jewish people still exist, and they still went through genocide. It's not about total extermination. It's about the intent to exterminate. So I'm putting up my next slide. So the United Nations has something called United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And there's actually 46 articles to this, but I'm going to focus on one article, Article 8, which I thought was the best one that we could use to describe our situation. Because today we are known as Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, Mestizo, and Raza. And we actually do not look at those terms as cultural genocide, which they are. And even in today's world, we're always told, well, you have to assimilate. Well, no, you don't. As indigenous people, we have the right to not assimilate. So let's look at Article 8 from the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. Number 1, indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Number 2, states shall provide effective mechanisms for preventing of and reduce redress for any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct people or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. So let's stop right there and think of that. Anything that prevents us from identifying as our ethnic identities. We're not going to sit here and not act like media doesn't do that. Media does that through Telemundo and Univision. You're never going to hear them say that we're indigenous. B, any action which has aim or effect of disposing them of lands and territories or resources. Through these terms, our resources are stolen every day. We're held in collective poverty because we're not identifying as indigenous. C, any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. D, any form of forced assimilation or integration. E, any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. So I think this was really unique, like when you look at it on just on the level of why is it that we're never promoted in the media as indigenous people? We're always promoted as something else. And when you look at the root meaning of every word that we're labeled, it's really How are we going to identify with Latino if Latino is the Spanish translation of Latin? Latin people aren't from Semanawak. Latin X. That is just adding an X to Latin, so there's no real difference. Hispanic, I'm not from Spain. Mestizo, well, technically, if you know the background of that, mestizo was synonymous with mongrel, synonymous with bastard. So I don't think I want to identify with such a negative term. And then raza comes from la raza cósmica. And if you have read Jose Vasconcelos' book, he was not fond of indigenous people. He thought we had no culture. He thought we shouldn't even be breeding. And anyways, at the end of the day, la raza cósmica is just a romanticization of eugenics. So now I'm gonna go on and discuss biological terrorism by Europeans, and I want to focus on just what the letters between the British Europeans did, because they basically planned it out and they thought that it would be a great idea to infect indigenous people with smallpox to eliminate them. It was during Pontiac's War. So I'm going to read Jefferson Amherst's letter to Colonial Henry Bouquet, June 29, 1763. You actually can see the image right on top of the letter, but when Amherst replies to Bouquet. So let me start reading what he wrote. Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them. So Bouquet agrees with Amherst by replying on July 13, 1763, you will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to expatriate this execrable race. And then, like, just notice the words they're using. They have a disgust about a race. This is just about total extermination. This is not about winning the war or getting a terror. This is about extermination. So let's see. On I want to read a quote from Blood and Land: The Story of Native North American by J.C.H. King. And I'm gonna start the quote. Most notorious is the use of smallpox as an early form of biological warfare during Pontiac's rebellion around Fort Pitt in 1763 by the British. William Trent, a fur trader and land speculator in Pennsylvania and the Ohio Valley, son of founder of Trenton, New Jersey, invoiced the army in the summer of 1763 for replacements for 2 blankets and a handkerchief of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect of spreading smallpox. These were provided to parlaying Delaware leaders, Turtle Heart and Mammal T. The invoice actually specifying 2 sundries got to replace in kinds those which were taken from people in the hospital to convey the smallpox to the Indians. 2 blankets, 1 silk handkerchief, and 1 linen due. Next month, Lord Amherst, commander of the British forces, made it clear to commander of the Fort Pitt that such measures were expropriate, writing, you will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try to every other method that can serve to expropriate these execrable race. So this is pretty much the smoking gun that they understood, biological terrorism, specifically using smallpox, and that they wanted the extermination of the race. It wasn't, like I said, just to win the war, and those are the smoking guns for specifically during Pontiac's War. So I'm gonna put on the next slide.
And if you guys could take a moment just to look at the primary source that she's sharing, it's really important that we understand that there are primary sources that we can find and read for ourselves of how they did this.
Thank you. After the incident with the smallpox, it was estimated that 400,000 to 500,000, possibly up to 1.5 million Nican, Tlaca men, women, and children died during Pontiac's years after Pontiac's War, mostly from the smallpox given by the British. And again, this wasn't a war for territory. This was a war for extermination. They wanted to infect women and children They did not just want to eliminate Pontiac's warriors. And we must reflect on the fact that this was done through biological terrorism, because biological terrorism was not new in any sense to humanity. But again, because of these incidents that occurred, genocide was defined through these measures. And if you think about it, don't you think it's very immoral to exterminate a race, to want to destroy the children, the women, and then afterwards put them through schools to exterminate their identity, to not allow them to speak their languages, not allow them to even embrace their culture? So there are many aspects to genocide. So it's not just killing, but also destroying our identity.
Tlaca Yari for the great information, and you guys are welcome to, after the podcast, please take a look on your own time. There's a lot of information that we're sharing, a lot of quotes, a lot of primary sources. The information, what we're trying to show is that the information is there. The information that we're trying to bring to our people, we're trying to make it accessible. We're trying to make it easier for our people to understand. We're trying to decolonize as well. We're researching this as well. One of the things I just wanted to add to what Sister Yadi said was the smallpox, and she's working on a great presentation to present like the actual details and furthering her explanation on that. Is the smallpox as far as the Mexica. Like when we talk about the Mexica, and I had this experience where I was writing a research paper, and my professors were kind of like, well, there's not really a smoking gun, right? Not until the 18th century, which is the example that Sister Ayadi shared. And it's really difficult because it's not like the Spanish wrote, oh, we're going to infect the Mexica, you know, we're going to do this. But what we have to do is be critical and think about it as circumstantial evidence. How is it that the people that were aligning themselves with the Spanish after they fought in a lot of cases initially, why is it that they didn't become infected? How is it that the Mexica generals or the Mexica leading warriors, how is it that they died first of smallpox? So how is it that Malinche didn't die of smallpox? That tells you that it wasn't just, oops, you know, they're infected, you know, they're dying, we have no control. It tells you that there is an intent behind it, that there was a way that they were able to navigate who gets infected and who does not. Even though we don't have their actual writings in the letter of Cortez and the writings of Bernardino, Sahagún, obviously they're not going to talk about that. But what we have to be is critical. We have to connect the dots, and we need to see that following this circumstantial evidence, when you go to court, you may not have the writing of the person that said, I'm going to kill her at 5 p.m. today. No, you may not have that written statement by the killer, but the killer killed her at 5 p.m. and the killer was planning, and the killer was getting together the weapons, and the killer was planning what time she gets off of work, and the killer, you get what I'm saying? There are actions that they did, planned actions that they did. They placed themselves in certain situations. They did this. And again, this that they did here to us, they did this in Europe. They were practicing biological warfare in Europe. So they were doing it to each other in Europe. For them to act like, oops, we don't know what's going on with indigenous people, that's bullshit, because they knew how to do it in Europe. You don't forget what you were doing in your homeland once you invade a country. You bring that shit and you try to make it effective and productive against your enemy and the newfound land. So let's not pretend like they're just innocent and all of a sudden it was our fault. Our immune systems were at fault for not being immune to it, so we just died and it's our fault, and that's how, you know, the natives died, which is bullshit. And that's what we're deconstructing today. Talking about today, what do we know about genocide today? Well, we know that there's a Museum of Tolerance, right, that talks about the Jewish Holocaust, that does not mention Nican Tlaca genocide. Last I checked, they don't mention hardly anybody else. They mention themselves, which is fine. Then everyone should be able to, you know, honor their ancestors and all that. But we're on indigenous land. So you're on indigenous land and you're talking about Holocaust, and you're not even mentioning the indigenous people of this land in your Holocaust museum. That is unjust. That is unjust for our people. That is racist against our people, that you are building a museum on indigenous land about the Jewish Holocaust, but won't address the indigenous experience. So let's remind them, okay? That's great you're talking about your Holocaust, that's great you're talking about genocide, but let's remind you that you're still on indigenous land, that building is built on indigenous land. Let's also talk about the Armenian genocide. If you drive down the 60 freeway, there's a big sign commemorating the genocide of the Armenians. Again, that's great that that's being done. Everyone should learn about every genocide. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying, oh, only ours. We feel that that's fine. That's great. But we got to put this into perspective. This is our land. The identities that we're being given are connecting us to Europe. They want us to connect to Europe because they understand that identity is power. Identity connects us to land. The identity that they want us to connect us to is in Europe. That's not where we belong. We belong here on this continent. How else are we being, are they committing genocide acts against our people? The fact that we don't know our history, the fact that we're speaking English and Spanish, the fact that we favor whiteness in our communities, or white looking babies, and blue eyes and white features. The continuation of this genocide is ongoing. How else are we continuing this genocide? How else are we participating in this forced assimilation of genocide that wants to erase us, erase our traditions, erase our history, erase our experiences as indigenous people? To talk more about that, Sister Shoshishiwit is going to explain, we're talking about Columbus Day, right? That happened a few days ago. What's coming up next? It's Dia de los Muertos, right? And what happens before Dia de los Muertos? It's Halloween. But what is happening with the tradition of Dia de los Muertos, and how has that also been used as a tool against us, as a tool of genocide? So, Sister Shoshishiwit, please share with us some of your research, some of your perspectives about the ongoing genocide today.
Meshika, as a further motion to decolonize and digress the cultural genocide of our people, I decided to speak on the only major indigenous celebration that has survived more than 500 years past the beginning of our genocide, Dia de los Muertos. I have heard over the years, isn't that like the Mexican holiday, Halloween? No, it is not. Dia de los Muertos is an indigenous celebration in which we remember our loved ones who have returned to the ancestors and the earth. Dia de los Muertos is not a holiday in which we can confuse with Halloween, which is what brings up an important lesson to teach our children and the people around them. Misappropriating Dia de los Muertos is not okay. It continues the colonization of our people. Many people ask, well, if we can't do the Tlaca painting or the sugar skull painting on Halloween and it's our culture, well, what can we do? Well, what you can do is teach your family and your community members that they cannot wear the Tlaca face paint on Halloween. We are not a costume. We can also try to teach face painters, friends, family members that we know that actually face paint as a business, or even just for fun or just for parties, that they can opt out of the sugar skull and Tlaca painting any kind of gigs on Halloween. They can opt out of that. It's not something that might cost you a little bit of money, but it's not gonna, not doing it is not gonna cost, the whole holiday. But that's your contribution to it, is to just stop doing those Halloween gigs and doing the Tlaca face. You could also reintroduce and popularize the classic Tlaca painting with an indigenous style. As far as the bordering of the face, I see a lot of the sugar skull with the like scrolls or the pretty flowers or glitter. And although that might be pretty to look at, there's another way that we can bring back the indigenous style, and we can actually say, we could look at a face painting and say, oh yeah, that's a Dia de los Muertos Tlaca face, not a sugar skull popularized sugar skull face. Yeah, that's something you can do as a face painter. What else could we do? Belongs to us. Okay, we can also prior to the reason why I'm saying this is because this is a staple holiday that belongs to us, and that's not something that we're willing to give up. We have very few holidays. Over the last 10 years, I think that Mexican New Year has been popularized in the conscious community that I've seen. And even though we have that, Dia de los Muertos is the most known, actually internationally. Prior to colonization, the celebration of Dia de los Muertos took place in the beginning of summer. Gradually, it was associated with October 31st. November 1st and November 2nd, to coincide with the Christian church's All Saints' Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day. We can stop recognizing the Dia de los Muertos in November and move it back to the original summertime celebration it was meant to be celebrated in. The cempasúchil, which is also known as the marigold, is a staple flower of the Dia de los Muertos, which makes sense to me, seeing as the cempasúchil starts blooming in June. That's pretty logical, right? Our people did not do things illogically. We did them by season, and that just makes more sense to us to take back and own our celebrations as we know the information that we know of them, and take them back. Why are we allowing for the Christian church to dictate that this is when you're going to celebrate because it coincides with our holiday? I'm sorry, but we need to decolonize holidays just as well, the few that we have, just as well as our minds. And yeah, that's my suggestion as far as decolonizing Dia de los Muertos.
Gracias, Mati, sister, for sharing that. And you touch upon a very important aspect, how many times the Spanish crown, in unison with the Catholic Church, we're trying to find ways to convert our people. Again, after the massacres, after the persecuting of our people for indigenous knowledge, after the laws prohibiting our indigenous information, our culture, our heritage, this was part of the extirpation campaigns. So they're trying to hijack our original celebrations and bring them into European holidays. And that was a way to convert us, to force us into something that does not belong to us. And we can talk about this in our other podcast, because we have the Virgen de Guadalupe that was used as this. We have a lot of the saints today that, if you trace back, they come from indigenous reasons and indigenous sources. So we have to understand, and it's hard as you're decolonizing, because a lot of our people were so emotionally attached to these religions and these traditions and these customs. It's really painful to detox, and a lot of people refuse to let go because of that trauma. And we have to understand it's been a very traumatic experience. So we understand that, but nonetheless, we have an obligation to point this out and to cleanse ourselves from, like Sister Shoshishiwa was talking about, how this hijacked. And we got to do our best, like she was saying, to reclaim our celebrations, to dust them off of this European crap that they put on them, and to really honor who we are. But again, that can only be done with research, with taking those courageous acts of resistance, of saying, no, thank you. We don't need Christianity. We don't need Catholicism. We don't need white culture. We don't need Europeans. We got this. We understand. We have our own celebrations. We have our own identities. That's what we're trying to do here. We want to share with you an awesome video that Sister Ayari did, talking about genocide, talking about the killers of our people, talking about all these white heroes that America throws at us and that forces us to study and memorize their stupid quotes and speeches in K through 12 education. We have a video. If you want to talk a little bit more about what the video is about.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to see if we could get this playing. I wanted to show people the quotes of the so-called founding fathers, but they're just the founding fathers of our genocide. And when it comes to their quotes, you can see, I mean, at least to me, when I'm reading them, I see intense hatred, and it's all dedicated to describing how they would want us exterminated, how we're worthless people. So it's very, when they tell us that these people are great, I mean, because technically it seems like when they describe them here, they almost have a sainthood, to be honest. It's almost like they're saints of some sort. It's almost like they're the only ones that have ever in the world created democracy, which is false, because we have the Iroquois nation, which is the oldest democracy on earth. And then you want me to think that these killers were the ones that invented that. So let's see if we can get the video playing live.
If it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. Lay waste all the settlements around with instructions to do it in the most effectual manner, that the country may not be merely overrun but destroyed. But you will not by any means listen to any overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effected. Our future security will be in their inability to injure us, the distance to which they are driven, and in the terror with which the severity of the chastisement they receive will inspire them. The immediate objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops in the ground and prevent their planting more. Pursue them to extermination, or drive them to new seats beyond our reach. The confirmed brutalization, if not the extermination of this race in our America, is therefore to form an additional chapter in the English history. We shall thus get clear of this pest without giving offense or umbrage to the Indians. In this way our settlements will gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, and they will in time either incorporate with us as citizens of the US, or remove beyond the Mississippi. This unfortunate race, whom we had been taking so much pains to save and to civilize, have by their unexpected desertion and ferocious barbarities justified extermination and now await our decision on their fate. My original convictions upon this subject have been confirmed by the course of events for several years, and experience is every day adding to their strength. That those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear.
Tlaca, Sister Yadi, for sharing that awesome video. And just to invite everyone else, we have a lot of material on our Nican Tlaca Women Warriors page. If you're listening on Facebook, Tlaca, if you're listening on YouTube, Tlaca, we have a lot of information, a lot of informative memes, how they call them, posters, posts, videos, podcasts. We're doing everything we can to continue the decolonization of our people, of ourselves, in an open, transparent, and collective manner. And to kind of wrap up today's discussion, I know it's, you know, it's a sad topic, right? To talk about genocide doesn't feel good. This is a tragedy. It's a trauma. But days like these are an opportunity for us to think back and honor our ancestors. It's a great way for us to remember what they went through for us to be here. Our ancestors that gave their lives, that fought, the heroes that we talked about with our opening poem, all the unnamed heroes, male and female, are people who gave their life fighting Europeans, fighting white supremacy. So it's important to remember and take this as an opportunity to educate ourselves, our family, our friends, and just to remind ourselves that, you know what, we're on our land. We survived the genocide. We're not going to stay quiet. We're not going to just simply bow down, be quiet, and accept white supremacy. We're going to keep talking. We're going to keep educating. We're going to keep honoring our ancestors. We're going to keep celebrating who we are. With that, I want to go around the round table here. And I'm going to have Sister Shoshishiwi just kind of share your ending remarks, you know, things that you want to share before we end the podcast, on things that you want to remember about genocide, things you want to let everyone know about your views on genocide.
I think it's important to remember that the genocide hasn't ended. Every day we deal with something new, whether it's identity, telling us who we are, so-called Latino, Hispanic, whether it has to do with our holidays or whether it has to do with our children. Every day we're still dealing with the genocide. So our job is to stand up and resist. Just resist. Do not let Europeans dictate what our holidays are going to be, how we're going to teach our children, how we're going to raise our children, how we're going to identify. Just every single day resist, because it is not ended. It is not over. We are not these so-called token survivors. We are living, we are thriving, we've always been here. So just resist. That's mine.
Let's go, Mati. Now, Sister Yari, if you can add your ending remarks, please.
I want to comment on the fact that a lot of us sometimes say that, well, the people that came over, they really don't represent Christianity. They weren't good Christians, so that's not what Christianity teaches. You know, and when I say Christianity, we're just talking about an old world religion that has a history back to, back to the Middle East. So when the Europeans got it, it wasn't even necessarily the religion. But then again, the book does justify genocide. In the Torah or the Old Testament, there is a lot of examples you could actually take from it to see that their God called for genocide. So I want to extract something that I wrote from a post on Nican, Tlaca Women Warriors regarding this. These actions are not a perversion of the Christian doctrine found in the Bible, because this book encourages violence and genocide. Joshua 6:15 through 21, that's an actual Bible verse that you could read, where Yahweh, their God, calls for the destruction of a people because they're quote-unquote idolaters. The Bible has a concept, which is what that's why I'm referencing that quote or Bible verse, to explain to you that there's a Bible concept of devoting to destruction or completely destroyed, known as herem. So that's an actual term that you could find in the Bible. Contemporary terms for this would be ethnic cleansing or genocide. So later on, Europeans or pilgrims that came over extracted that idea and applied it to themselves. The whole, how like they have the whole promised land in the Bible, and there's some people that are considered themselves the chosen people. Well, Europeans, when they came over, they attached themselves to that story, which is interesting because that's also what created Manifest Destiny. Europeans saw themselves as the chosen people, and Semanawak was the promised land. The Old Testament is full of stories about mass extermination of idolaters, and in this case, our Nican Tlaca ancestors were the idolaters. So right now, I'm going to quote from a book called Confronting Genocide, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Starting quote, "The biblical injunctions of the Jewish and Christian traditions were an integral part of Waisel's calls, a movement of ideas, and of Deloria's track record of Christianity." So these are two scholars that are writing that the way that they describe the justification of these actions through the Bible. The one person saying there's a track record about that in Christianity, and the other ones it's a movement of ideas because they're extracting it from the Bible. So back to the quote. "The chosen people and the promised land notions of the Old Testament were used by the Western Europeans and by the Euro-Americans to justify the destruction of indigenous peoples and the dispossession and expropriation of native lands and resources. These scripture verses were significant contributors to the perpetration of genocide of the indigenous peoples of the United States." End quote.
Beautifully said, Sister Ayari. And to end on something that I forgot to read earlier, following exactly on what Sister Yari is talking about, what Sister Shoshu was talking about, this whole idea of destruction, this whole idea of genocide, of people not being, not deserving to live because they don't live under your guide of religion and Christianity. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from a paper I wrote about genocide, just to get you an idea. Obviously, they're coming to our continent with these pre-notions, these preconceptions of power, of absolute authority, and of this whole very fatal, very tragic way of viewing humanity. And it says, religious documents or edicts like the Requerimiento and the Papal Bulls established the anti-indigenous attitude that declared a complete disregard for indigenous people's lives. The Requerimiento and other documents alike was a declaration to the people of Nican Tlaca, of Semanawak, by the Spanish crown, demanding their immediate surrender and submission to the church, threatening, quote, mischief and harm, end quote, if they refused. Spanish soldiers were required to read the following decree every time the, quote, Indian refused to even delayed their acceptance to the Requerimiento. And the following is an exact excerpt from the Requerimiento. I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can. We shall take your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can." End quote. Such declarations also gave Europeans direct rule over any land or peoples they would come across. They served both moral and political purposes to further the colonial efforts of Europe in the quote-unquote New World. The requerimiento, therefore, the public statements declaring intent to destroy and subordinate indigenous people. They were used to wage war against indigenous people, making those who failed to surrender slaves of the Spanish crown. Obviously, our ancestors did not speak Spanish. This was like a complete flaw in the rationale. How the heck were we supposed to submit and surrender to something we don't even understand where it's being said to us? So that was just a justification to instantly subjugate our people and kill us. And this further talks about, because in Raphael Lemkin's, there's been a lot of debates about what is genocide, what is not. There has to be an intent. There has to be an intent to destroy. Well, this requerimientos prove that this was the intention to destroy us. It wasn't something that we can go back and say, oh, this was the end result. No, they stated exactly what they were going to do, and they did it. Therefore, that completely enhances and completely represents the idea of genocide. And just to end with a quote from American Holocaust, which is a great book to read about the genocide of our people, and perhaps the only historian that aggressively and assertively talks about our experience as genocide. He says, according to standard, the requerimiento provided, quote, a legalistic rationale for the fanatically religious and fanatically judicial and fanatically brutal people to justify a Holocaust, end quote. They gave the Spanish a blanket check to pillage nations with full blessings from the Catholic Church. He notes that these declarations were made to Nican Tlaca people in a language that they did not understand, and furthermore, quote, they, the Nican Tlaca, had no opportunity to reply, being immediately carried away as prisoners. So again, this information we're sharing with you. We're doing the research. We invite you to join us in this study and this research. We invite you to check out the videos, the postings, the podcasts that we're going to be doing. In the past 2 podcasts, this is our 3rd podcast. In the past podcast, we've talked about identity. We've also talked about the concept of a pan-indigenous identity. This time we were talking about Nican Tlaca. We invite you to our future podcast in which we're trying to choose a topic each podcast in which we're going to deconstruct to the best of our ability. We're also doing presentations, pre-recorded presentations through PowerPoint and other ways. We're going to be going into mestizaje. We're going to go into the deconstruction of the concept of Nican Tlaca. We're going to go into so many more topics. So we want to thank everyone for all your support. We want to thank everyone for supporting our page, our work, promoting the work that we're doing. And again, thank you for your time sharing with us a Saturday evening with us. We really appreciate it. And with that, I just want to say Tlazokamati to all of you. Tlazokamati, Sister Ayari, Sister Shoshishiwit. We're very passionate about this. We're very excited to continue sharing our work. Again, this is going to be on our Facebook. It's on our YouTube. And every month, we're dedicating ourselves to do at least one podcast in which we continue to decolonize, liberate, and defend Semanawak. With that, Tlazokamati.
Tlazokamati.
Tlazokamati.